We talked a little about how gouache behaves, but let's dive deeper into its properties. Gouache dries fast, but if the room you're in is more humid, it will dry slower. It also dries matte. This can be very useful for determining if your paint is still wet. If it looks shiny in any way, then you're seeing water, so it's still wet. Also, colors tend to shift a little bit as they dry. Usually, and this depends on the paint you're using, darker colors become lighter and lighter colors become darker. This can make it very hard or impossible to match the same color by mixing it again. But the higher quality paint you have, the less noticeable the shift is. Another thing that can happen is paint cracking if you use too much of it. This usually doesn't happen, but is something to watch out for if you plan to use it very thick with many layers. This is also something that cheaper paints tend to do more of, and it's something acrylic gouache is very immune to. Now, the most important property of gouache, in my opinion, is that it can be reactivated with water at any time. This can be extremely useful for fixing mistakes or reworking a dry painting, but it's definitely something you need to be aware of at all times, especially when layering. We'll talk about this more in a future lesson. But there is a nifty workaround to this if it bothers you. Like I said before, you can use acrylic gouache. When your paint is dry with acrylic gouache, it will be dry forever. Another perk to using acrylic gouache is that the color you see is the color you will get when it's dry, and it's also way less prone to cracking. So there are a lot of benefits to it, and I encourage you to think about how you would like to paint before you buy your paints so you can pick the right paint for you. I highly recommend it if you want to layer a lot, and I would give it some thought. You can get almost the same effects with both, but it just depends on how you like to work. Normal gouache is like oil paints because it can be reworked, and acrylic gouache is like acrylic paint because once it's dry, and you just have to layer it more. Like I said earlier, gouache can do anything that watercolor can. Like for example, here I drop salt into a wet layer and let it dry. Once it's dry, I can scrape off the salt and we get this beautiful texture. I got this technique from using watercolors. So if you want to learn more interesting techniques on using diluted gouache, you can check out my Anyone Can Watercolor class to learn them. But the most fun one is hands down the wet and wet technique. This just means we apply wet paint to wet paper with or without paint, and it will spread around and do fun things. The paint spreads a little differently from watercolor, and the particles are more visible because they're bigger. But the effect is still beautiful. Also, with gouache, if you use more paint, you will get more fun textures, which look way different from the watercolor ones. I personally love them, but if you don't like them, just don't use the wet and wet gouache technique and instead just use less water. You can also make gradients by using more water on one side and more paint on the other, or you could just use white gouache instead of water. We'll go into blending in a future lesson, but my point is it's a very versatile medium. Now let's get our hands dirty and dive into the details of how it works and how to use it, by starting with flow and opacity.